He's a former SEAL specializing in training service dogs, a war survivor, but he was completely unprepared for the tiny whimper he heard beneath a frozen bridge. A German shepherd puppy lay there shivering, hungry, and gasping for breath. As Luke lifted the frail body from the ice, he didn't know he was saving more than just a dog. What followed transformed a wounded soldier and an abandoned puppy into the center of a miracle. Before we begin, let me know where you started watching in the comments below. Winter pressed hard against the Colorado mountains, the storm crawling over Crestwood like a living creature made of wind and ice. Luke Carter drove slowly through the swirling white, his truck headlights carving a faint tunnel through the darkness. At 37, he carried himself with the rigid quietness of a man shaped by war. A broad-shouldered figure with a straight spine, a dark beard trimmed close to his jaw, and storm-gray eyes that watched the road the way a soldier watches an uncertain horizon. Snow collected on the corners of his windshield, and beneath the hum of the engine, his thoughts drifted to old ghosts that never quite slept. The road to his cabin wound like a scar along the frozen mountainside. Wooden guardrails leaned over ravines crusted in ice, and tall pines bowed under the weight of accumulating snow. Luke knew this road more intimately than he wished. Every turn, every dip, every silent memory stitched along the way. His gloved hands tightened around the steering wheel as a familiar ache pulsed in his chest. A year had passed since Shadow, his K9 partner with a golden coat and an unbreakable spirit, had died in his arms on foreign soil. The silence since then had become a second battlefield, one he had never trained for. As he rounded a curve near the old wooden bridge, his truck jolted slightly on a slick patch of ice. Luke leaned forward, squinting through the snow-glossed windshield. Something moved beneath the bridge, a small quivering shape almost swallowed by the storm. He slowed, brows knitting. In another life, he might have kept driving, but instinct, the same instinct that had pulled him through collapsed buildings and burning streets, pressed hard against his ribs. Something was alive down there, something too small to fight the cold alone. He pulled over, boots crunching into deep powder as he stepped out. The cold hit him sharply, a biting reminder of the world's indifference. Wind sliced sideways beneath the bridge as he carefully climbed down the embankment, each step sinking into snow. The noise came again, a thin, brittle cry that almost vanished under the roaring storm. Luke followed the sound into the shadows, where the darkness pooled thick beneath the wooden beams. There, half buried in a sagging cardboard box soaked with icy water, lay a single German shepherd puppy. It was heartbreakingly small, barely 6 weeks old, its fur a muddied mixture of black and tan matted to its shivering body. One tiny ear drooped while the other twitched weakly. When the puppy tried to lift its head, its movements were stiff, its breath shallow and uneven. Snowflakes clung to its fragile whiskers, and its paws, so impossibly small, trembled uncontrollably. The rocks weighing down the box made Luke's stomach tighten. Someone hadn't just abandoned this animal, they'd tried to keep it from being found. A familiar heat flared beneath his ribs, the kind that came from places of grief not yet healed. The puppy whimpered again, and the sound pierced him like a crack in armor. He crouched lower, his breath fogging in the cold air as memory struck him hard. Shadow dying in a pool of dust and blood, Luke whispering promises he couldn't keep. Watching another helpless creature fade felt like reliving a wound still bleeding. "Easy, little one," he murmured, lowering a gloved hand. His voice, though rough from disuse, softened in a way he hadn't heard from himself in months. The puppy recoiled first, trembling, but then leaned forward, nose touching his knuckles. The touch was faint, but it was enough. enough to stir something fragile and forgotten inside him, something warm beneath all the winter he carried. Luke slid his arm beneath the freezing pup, lifting it with slow, steady care. The puppy weighed almost nothing. Its body was frighteningly cold, breath rattling through its tiny chest. Without hesitation, he tucked the pup inside his jacket, pulling it tight against him to share heat. The puppy pressed against his heartbeat, still trembling, but no longer alone. For a moment, Luke remained crouched beneath the bridge, snow whipping around him as he held the fragile creature close. His mind raced, not with panic, but with grim calculation, breathing rate, skin temperature, the sluggishness of the pup's movements. Signs of hypothermia, signs of fever, signs he knew too well. "Not tonight," he whispered into the storm, as if bargaining with something unseen. "You're not dying out here. Not tonight." He climbed the embankment with careful, deliberate steps, shielding the pup from the wind. When he slid back into the truck, heat blasted against his face, but it felt inadequate compared to the cold gnawing at the small body in his arms. He cupped the puppy closer, feeling the chill radiating through its fur, its breath fluttering weakly. Beneath the pup's side, he noticed an inflamed patch of reddened skin, swollen and hot to the touch. Infection. A bad one. The drive to the cabin became a slow, anxious crawl along the snow-laden road. Luke stole glances at the pup, each one tightening the knot in his chest. The infection was spreading, its breathing too shallow, its movements too faint. "Stay with me, Riley," he muttered suddenly, the name forming unbidden. And strangely, it fit. The pup gave a soft, barely there whine, as if acknowledging the name in its weak state. By the time he reached the narrow path to his cabin, the storm had thickened into a near whiteout. His cabin, built of old logs and stubborn endurance, glowed from a lantern left burning earlier. Smoke drifted weakly from the chimney, struggling against the wind. Luke parked close to the porch and pushed through the cold again, holding Riley beneath his jacket like the most precious thing in his arms. Inside, warm air wrapped around him, laced with pine wood and the familiar scent of solitude. He laid Riley gently onto a thick wool blanket near the dormant fire, then rushed to stack dry logs into the hearth. Flames soon flickered to life, casting shaky light across the room. Riley's small chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath of fragile battle. The infection along its side throbbed with an angry heat that worried Luke deeply. Kneeling beside the pup, he placed a steady hand behind its ear, brushing damp fur aside. Riley's eyes cracked open briefly, dark, glossy, searching. Luke felt something tighten in his throat, a raw ache he hadn't expected. "Riley," he whispered again, voice low and certain, "you're gonna be okay." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. He had no antibiotics strong enough here, no proper medical supplies, not for an infection this advanced. Outside, the storm battered the cabin, rattling windows and howling through the pines. Inside, Riley whimpered softly, curling weakly onto the blanket. Luke rose slowly, jaw tightening with the kind of resolve forged from years in uniform. If he waited until morning, the pup would not survive. Every instinct, every memory, every scar pushed him toward the same decision. He grabbed his coat, his boots, and his flashlight. He would return to the storm, not for duty, not for orders, but for the tiny life that had looked at him with trust beneath the bridge, a life he refused to lose. Not again. The storm had grown heavier by the time Luke Carter forced open his cabin door again, the wind shoving violently against him, as if the mountain itself wished to keep him inside. But Riley's fragile breaths echoed behind him, like a pulse he could not ignore. Each tiny inhale a reminder that time was not an ally tonight. He pulled up his hood, braced himself, and stepped into the blinding white. The snow reached halfway up his boots, and the path toward Emma Hale's house, normally a short walk, looked like a twisting river of shifting ice. He scanned the towering pines leaning over the trail, their branches sagging like old men too tired to hold themselves upright, and began trudging forward with the focused determination that once carried him through battlefields far louder than this silent, merciless winter. Though Crestwood sat quietly at the foot of the range, Emma Hale lived on a slightly raised ridge, a modest wooden home tucked beneath a canopy of thick evergreens. Luke had met her only twice before, once when he first moved into his cabin, asking about nearby veterinary clinics, and once at the local supply store where she'd purchased feed, while chatting with townsfolk in her warm, steady voice. He remembered her gentle presence even then, though he hadn't expected to ever need her help tonight. Emma was in her late 40s, a woman of medium height with a slender, willow-like frame, silvering hair pinned loosely beneath a knitted beanie, and soft brown eyes shaped like someone who had spent more years caring for wounded animals than for herself. Her complexion carried the faint sun-kissed warmth of someone who lived much of her life outdoors, and her posture spoke of quiet resilience, built not from war, but from years of healing the broken things the world left on her doorstep. Luke pushed forward through the narrowing trail, his breath fogging deeply with every step. He clutched his flashlight, the beam cutting a faint path ahead. The storm muted all sound, no cracking branches, no rustling wildlife, only the slow, haunted echo of his own footsteps. With every stride, his mind clung to the thought of Riley lying helpless by the fire. The puppy's small body had been far too hot beneath his fingers, its breaths too shallow. Luke's chest tightened at the memory, and he felt something familiar but unwelcome rising in him. Fear. Not fear of the storm nor the cold, but fear of losing something again before he even had time to understand why it mattered. As he reached Emma's porch, the faint glow of a lantern flickered inside the window. He knocked once, then twice. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass, and the door opened to a burst of warm, cedar-scented air. Emma stood there, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, a long brown coat thrown loosely over her shoulders. Her expression shifted at once when she saw him, surprise, then concern, and then determination, swift and unwavering. "Luke, what on earth? Come in. You're freezing." Her voice held both steadiness and urgency, like someone who rarely panicked but understood immediately when a situation demanded her full focus. He stepped inside, snow dripping from his coat onto her wooden floor. Emma's home felt lived in and gentle, decorated with hanging dried herbs, soft quilts, and framed sketches of animals she had cared for. She motioned for him to speak, but he took only a single breath before answering. "It's a puppy," he said quietly, his voice strained. "German Shepherd, found under the bridge. He's barely breathing, and there's an infection, a bad one." Emma didn't waste a single second. Her eyes sharpened with clinical clarity as she reached for a large canvas medical bag resting beside the bookshelf. "Where is he?" she asked. Luke exhaled, the cold still clinging to his skin. "At the cabin. He won't last till morning." She nodded once, firm, decisive, already slipping her arms into a thick winter parka. Luke watched her move, impressed by the practiced efficiency in her gestures. She had the calm steadiness of someone who had spent decades fighting quiet battles against time, saving a calf in the snow, treating a fox caught in wire, comforting old pets during their final hours. Emma Hale was a healer in every sense of the word. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, a thermos of warm water, a sealed packet of antibiotics, and a pair of insulated gloves. As she zipped her coat, her expression softened just enough for Luke to see a flicker of something personal, concern, but also something deeper he couldn't quite name. "Let's go," she said. "Lead the way." They pushed into the storm together. Luke shielded Emma with his larger frame when gusts hit, and she followed closely, her boots leaving small prints beside his deeper ones. The forest around them rumbled as wind rushed between the trunks, bending branches that groaned like old timber in a shipwreck. Emma's flashlight beam illuminated the path, brighter and steadier than Luke's fading light. She navigated the trail with surprising familiarity. "I've walked this way every winter for 20 years, she murmured through her scarf. "Storms don't scare me much anymore." Luke glanced at her briefly. "You always this calm when a life's on the line." She gave a small smile, one touched with a quiet sadness. "You learn to be. Panicking never saved anything." He wondered then what losses she carried beneath that collected demeanor, because no one becomes this steady without having weathered storms far worse than the ones outside. By the time they reached the cabin, both were dusted in white, their boots heavy with snow. Luke pushed the door open, and heat washed over them. Riley lay curled on the blanket where Luke had left him, his breaths faint but present, his eyes half open in confusion. Emma knelt immediately beside him. Her movements were gentle, yet firm, her fingertips steady as she checked his temperature, inspected the inflamed wound, and felt for hydration along his gums. "He's fighting," she whispered, "but he won't win without help." Luke knelt on the opposite side, watching her hands work over Riley's trembling body. Guilt tugged at him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he could not shake the memory of shadow, of failing once, of the heaviness that had followed him all the way to Crestwood. Riley stirred weakly at the sound of Luke's breath, and something in Luke's chest shifted painfully, fiercely. This tiny life was depending on him. Again. Emma mixed antibiotics with warm water, using a small dropper to administer the dose. Riley resisted at first, but she kept murmuring soft encouragements, her voice a blanket warmer than the fire itself. Luke found himself watching her more than he intended, the lines of concentration on her brow, the patience in her posture, the quiet strength she radiated. She was a woman who had spent her life tending to broken things. Perhaps that's why she moved with such certainty even when the outcome was uncertain. Hours slipped by as they worked, taking turns warming Riley with blankets, offering small sips of water, and adjusting the fire. Luke shared bits of his past he rarely said aloud, not the missions, not the medals, but the night Shadow died saving him. Emma listened without interrupting, her eyes soft with an empathy that didn't pity him but understood him. When he finished, she rested a gentle hand on his forearm. "You didn't fail him, Luke. Dogs don't measure love by survival. They measure it by loyalty." Her words cut deeper than the cold ever could, reaching places he'd tried hard to bury. Sometime near dawn, Riley's fever began to break. His breathing grew steadier, no longer shallow, but pulling air with small but determined effort. The infection, though still angry, no longer held the same terrifying edge. Luke leaned back against the wall, exhaustion settling into his bones like a quiet surrender. Emma covered Riley with a fresh blanket and allowed herself a slow exhale of relief. For the first time that night, Luke saw her smile. Not a polite smile, but one full of quiet triumph. The storm outside softened to a gentler whisper, and the first pale hints of morning filtered through the frost-coated window. Riley slept curled beside the fire, no longer trembling. Emma rose slowly, stretching her tired limbs. "He's not out of danger," she murmured, "but he has a chance now." Luke nodded, gratitude filling his chest in a way he didn't know how to voice. Emma met his eyes, and for a moment something warm passed between them, an unspoken understanding that this night had changed more than just a puppy's fate. And as the snow eased its grip on the mountains, Emma realized what Luke had not yet admitted. Riley wasn't just a life to be saved. Riley was the life that would begin to save him. Morning crept slowly across the mountains, its pale winter light sliding through the frost-glazed window of Luke Carter's cabin. The storm had passed during the early hours, leaving behind a world softened under thick blankets of snow. Riley slept curled in a tight ball near the fire, his tiny chest rising with steadier breaths than the night before. Luke sat beside him, elbows resting on his knees, his face lit by the low glow of embers. The exhaustion behind his eyes ran deep, deeper than a sleepless night, deeper than the cold. But there was something new there, too, a fragile piece of hope that hadn't existed yesterday. Emma Hale had fallen asleep in the old armchair across the room, her coat draped over her like a second blanket, her silver-streaked hair loose around her calm, tired face. For the first time in months, the cabin felt less empty. Luke rose quietly, stepping outside to fetch more wood. The air was brutally crisp, burning the inside of his lungs with each inhale. Snow coated every surface in a pristine shimmer, turning the forest into a quiet cathedral of white. He lifted an armful of logs and turned back, only to stop when the crunch of tires approached along the narrow road. A white wildlife control truck eased into view, its blue and green emblem reflecting in the morning light. Luke's brows tightened. He hadn't expected visitors. Not today. The truck door opened, and a tall man stepped out, adjusting the collar of his heavy uniform jacket. The stranger moved with the posture of someone accustomed to long days in rugged terrain. He looked to be in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with weathered skin tanned by years outdoors. His beard was dense and graying, trimmed short around a strong jaw, while deep lines carved the corners of his eyes a sharp slate blue that missed nothing. This was a man built from wilderness and duty. The name patch on his jacket read, Officer Mark Dalton. Mark approached the porch with steady steps, his boots sinking lightly into the snow. He gave a polite but firm nod. "Morning. You Luke Carter?" His voice came low, slightly gravelly, with the tone of someone who had delivered difficult news far too many times. Luke set the firewood aside, crossing his arms. "That's me. Something I can help you with?" Mark's gaze swept briefly toward the window where Riley slept inside. "We've had a report," he said. "A sighting of an unregistered canine near the protected forest line. Given the recent trouble with a wolf-dog breeding operation in this region, we're required to check every case." Luke stiffened slightly. He had heard about the illegal kennel, heard how animals that were mistreated, chained, bred in secrecy, until wildlife control shut it down last month. But he had not expected that tragedy to reach his doorstep. Inside, Emma stirred awake, rising from the armchair. She stepped to the doorway, tightening her coat around her. "Officer Dalton," she said with a calm nod. "Morning." Mark's expression softened slightly with recognition. "Dr. Hale? Didn't expect to find you out here." Emma's gaze flicked to Luke, then to the truck. "What's going on?" she asked gently. "A report," Mark repeated, "of a puppy near this ridge. I've got to verify its origin. Rules are tighter after the wolf-dog case. Some locals are jumpy." Luke exhaled through his nose, shoulders tense but steady. "He's not from some kennel. Someone dumped him in a box under the bridge during the storm. Emma can confirm that." Emma stepped forward, her voice sure but diplomatic. "I treated him last night. He's a German Shepherd puppy, about 6 weeks old, malnourished, feverish, and definitely abandoned." Mark listened, jaw tightening. He wasn't a man quick to doubt others, but he was clearly a man sworn to rules that kept chaos at bay. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Luke hesitated, but stepped aside. Mark entered a cabin with a respectful nod, removing his gloves as he looked around the modest space. The fire crackled softly. Riley lifted his head slightly at the intrusion, ears twitching, dark eyes wide with lingering fear. Mark crouched down carefully, maintaining enough distance not to spook the fragile animal. "Small," he murmured. "Too young to be out here alone." His eyes shifted to the inflamed patch of skin. "Infection's bad. Whoever dumped him meant business." For a fleeting moment, something in Mark's expression softened, a memory flickering behind his eyes. Though he said nothing, the heaviness in his face suggested he had seen too many abandoned animals in his decades of service. People could be cruel, and Mark Dalton had been the one to clean up after them far too often. But then the cabin rattled faintly as a deep mechanical rumble echoed overhead. The sound grew louder, steady, rhythmic, unmistakable. A helicopter. Emma stepped to the window, peering upwards. "Rescue chopper," she said, "probably heading toward the northern ridge." The moment the vibration reached the walls, Riley jerked violently, his tiny body stiffening with panic. The puppy scrambled backward, pressing into the corner as the helicopter roared past. Luke reached for him, but Riley, driven by instinct and fear, squeezed through a loose gap between two wooden floorboards near the base of the wall, something Luke hadn't even noticed before, and darted outside into the blinding white. Luke's heartbeat slammed upward. Riley! He lunged for the door, bursting into the cold just fast enough to see small paw prints scattering across the fresh snow toward the tree line. The fear rising in his chest was sharp and dizzying, not the controlled alertness of a soldier, but the raw panic of someone who had already lost too much. Behind him, Mark stepped onto the porch, brow furrowed deeply. Emma appeared next, covering her mouth in shock. "Luke," she breathed. "He's terrified. The chopper must have set him off." Luke didn't respond. He was already moving. His boots tore through the snow as he followed the tiny prints weaving through the pines. Riley's trail was erratic, zigzags, slips, small uneven strides. But it was fresh. Luke knew how to read trails. He had tracked insurgents in deserts, fugitives through crumbling cities, and missing children through thick mountain brush. Tracking a 6-week-old puppy through soft snow should have been simple, but the terrain sloped upward toward steeper, more dangerous ground. Behind him, Mark shouted, "Carter, wait! The ridge up there is unstable." But Luke didn't stop, not when all he could hear was an echo of Shadow's final breath, not when another life now depended on him. Snow clung to his coat as he pushed through the forest, his breath harsh in the biting air. He could almost picture Riley, tiny paws stumbling, heart hammering with fear, alone again in a world too big and cold. Emma's voice carried faintly behind him. "We'll wait at the cabin. Call if you need help." But Luke barely heard her. His world had narrowed to a single path of paw prints, heading toward the mountain's rising spine. The wind sharpened, flinging icy powder against his eyes, yet he pressed on, faster and faster. Riley didn't know the dangers of the ridge. He didn't know that the ground could collapse without warning, or that predators roamed deeper in the forest, or that nightfall would turn the cold from dangerous to lethal. All he knew was fear, and all Luke knew was that he would not let that fear swallow the little life he had sworn silently, instinctively, to protect. The trail led upward toward jagged rocks dusted in white, and Luke quickened his pace, snow crunching hard beneath every determined stride. He prayed silently that he wasn't too late, that the world hadn't taken another companion from him. But as he climbed higher into the mountains, one truth cut through him with the sharpness of wind. He would not stop, not until he found Riley. Snow thickened again as Luke Carter climbed higher into the mountain, his breath a sharp rhythm in the cold, his boots chewing into the slope with controlled precision learned from years of battlefield terrain. The paw prints ahead of him were becoming more frantic, scattering sideways as if Riley had panicked and darted blindly. The forest grew darker as he ascended, the pines leaning over the ridge like solemn witnesses. Luke's shoulder throbbed under the strain of pushing through drifts, the same old injury that had never fully healed since a mission overseas when shrapnel had ripped through muscle and bone. He ignored the pain. The only thing that mattered now was a frightened puppy somewhere ahead, alone on unstable ground. The wind changed direction suddenly, carrying with it a faint sound, a small cry, thin and broken, like the echo of a whimper swallowed by the valley. Luke froze, tilting his head. There it was again, weaker but unmistakable. Riley. Luke quickened his pace, dodging between rocks as the terrain steepened. The sound guided him toward a jagged outcrop where the snow broke into a narrow, treacherous drop. Kneeling carefully, he brushed aside powder to reveal an opening beneath the ridge, a ravine carved sharply into the earth, hidden under layers of fresh snow. He leaned forward and aimed his flashlight down into the darkness, sweeping it slowly until the beam caught movement near a ledge 20 feet below. Riley was wedged against a wall of ice, trembling, a small patch of brown and black fur dusted with falling snowflakes. The pup tried to lift his head but failed, his paws scraping helplessly against a slick surface. Luke's heart clenched at the sight. The memories hit hard. The same helplessness he had felt the night his K9 partner Shadow bled out in his arms during an ambush, the same roaring guilt that lived in his bones ever since. He would not lose another. He yanked off his backpack and pulled out a coil of rope, frayed in a few places, but still strong. It was gear he kept from his service days, no longer regulation, but reliable enough for survival work. He wrapped the harness around his waist, tied a practiced mountaineer's knot, and looped the line securely around a thick pine whose roots clung tightly to the frozen slope. The descent was brutal. His boots scraped against ice and loose shale, each movement sending small avalanches of snow tumbling downward. His injured shoulder screamed with every shift of weight, but he clenched his jaw and pushed through it, lowering himself inch by inch until his boots reached the narrow ledge. Riley whimpered again as Luke approached, his tiny body shaking violently. Luke moved slowly, lowering his center of gravity to avoid slipping, and reached out one gloved hand. "Easy, buddy. I've got you now." Riley pressed into his palm with desperate relief, too exhausted to resist, too cold to understand anything except the warmth of a familiar scent. Luke scooped him gently into his jacket, securing the zipper to hold the small body against the heat of his chest. The climb back up was far more dangerous. Luke tightened the rope around his waist and began pushing upward, using his legs to brace against protruding rocks while pulling with his good arm. His shoulder burned with each pull, every movement pulling at old scar tissue, making his fingers go numb. Halfway up, as he shifted to reach a firmer hold, the rope jerked violently. For one terrifying second, Luke felt it slip through his gloves. An edge of the knot had caught on a sharp outcrop and begun to fray. Snowdust fell around him as the fibers groaned under the strain. Luke pressed his forehead against the rock, breathing hard. He couldn't afford to lose grip, not with Riley tucked inside his jacket, trusting him completely. He tried again, bracing his foot against a ridge and pushing upward, but the rope slipped a little more. His pulse spiked. He looked up at the fading sky, preparing for the possibility he might need to absorb a fall with his own body to protect the pup. His mind raced through calculations, angles, distances, how to twist midair to shield Riley if the rope failed. Old training surged through him, but so did an old fear, the fear of failing someone who depended on him. Then a voice cut through the wind from above. "Carter, hold on!" Luke's head snapped upward. A large silhouette appeared at the mouth of the ravine, leaning over with urgency. Officer Mark Dalton, braced himself against a pine, and fed another rope down toward him. Snow blew around the officer's graying beard and rugged face, his blue eyes sharp with focus. "I saw your cabin door wide open and tracks heading uphill. Figured something was wrong." His voice carried the steady authority of a man who had pulled more than one lost soul back from danger in his 30 years of service. Luke felt sudden relief, sharper than the cold. Dalton anchored his rope securely around a boulder before shouting, "Clip the pup to your chest and tie in. I've got you. Just move when I say." Luke adjusted Riley, who whimpered softly but stayed tucked against him, then tied Dalton's rope around his waist. Mark leaned back with his full weight, planting his boots into the snow. "All right, Carter. Climb." Luke pushed upward again, this time supported by Dalton's strength. Every movement was agony in his shoulder, but he kept going, focusing on Riley's faint warmth against his chest, on the absolute refusal to let the world take another piece of his heart. Snow burst around him as his hand finally reached the edge. Dalton gripped his forearm, pulling with a controlled force that brought Luke and Riley safely onto solid ground. Luke collapsed onto his back, gasping, snow melting into his hair. Dalton knelt beside him, his breath heavy. "You're insane," he muttered, though there was admiration in his tone, "but I'm glad I got here when I did." Luke unzipped his jacket just enough to reveal Riley's small head peeking out, still trembling, but alive. Dalton stared at the pup, his stern face softening. "He ran because he was scared," Luke said quietly. "Not wild, not dangerous. Just a baby someone threw away." Dalton exhaled, the kind of exhale that carried years of hard decisions and harder realities. He rose slowly and brushed snow from his coat. "Carter, I'm tearing up the report. Nobody's taking that dog from you." He nodded once, firmly, as if sealing something unspoken between them. Some rules are meant to protect. Others, well, sometimes they just get in the way. Luke felt a weight lift inside him, something lighter than relief, something steadier than gratitude. He held Riley closer as Dalton extended a hand. "Come on," the officer said. "Let's get the little guy home." And the three of them began the careful walk back toward the cabin, leaving behind the broken ravine and the echo of fear, carrying instead the fragile beginnings of something like trust. Spring arrived quietly in Crestwood, not with an explosion of color, but with small, deliberate gestures that mended the silence winter had left behind. The mountains shed their white armor, one layer at a time, revealing earth softened with moss and streams awakening beneath thinning ice. Luke Carter stood outside his cabin in the morning sun, watching Riley bound through patches of damp grass with the restless joy only a once-lost creature could understand. The German shepherd pup had grown quickly, no longer a trembling scrap of fur, but a sturdy, bright-eyed youngster with oversized paws and ears that never quite decided whether to stand or flop. His coat gleamed in tones of gold and charcoal beneath the light, and he carried himself with a confidence that made Luke smile despite himself. It was hard to believe this was the same frightened soul he had pulled from the snow. Luke turned toward the wooden table outside the cabin, where a manila folder lay open, weighed down by a ceramic mug filled with coffee. Inside the folder were official documents: Riley's vaccination records, microchip registration, proof of ownership, all neatly completed. The name printed on the forms read, Riley Carter, and seeing it stirred something warm inside Luke's chest. He hadn't expected paperwork to carry emotional weight, but claiming Riley officially felt like planting a stake in the ground, like acknowledging that the two of them were no longer wandering alone. They were, in every sense that mattered, a family. Emma Hale approached from the forest path a moment later, her boots brushing through budding ferns. She wore a light denim jacket over a soft gray sweater, and her silver-streaked hair was tied loosely behind her head in a way that made her look younger than the caring, steady-faced woman who had appeared in his cabin on a stormy night. A canvas bag hung from her shoulder, filled with supplies for the project that had grown from a simple idea into something that felt like destiny. "Morning, Luke," she said, her voice warm but bright with purpose. "I picked up the last set of medical kits." "Check twice. Everything we need is in there." Luke nodded gratefully. Emma was someone who delivered every promise quietly, reliably, qualities forged from years caring for animals whose only language was trust. Minutes later, an engine hummed along the dirt road, and Officer Mark Dalton stepped out of his wildlife control truck. Without his winter coat, he looked slightly softer, broad-shouldered in a forest green shirt, sleeves rolled to reveal strong arms freckled by sun and age. His graying beard caught the light, and his usual sternness was eased by something resembling quiet pride. Dalton carried 2 long wooden stakes over one shoulder. "Morning," he said, giving a short nod. "Fence posts. Figured we'd start marking out the perimeter before the volunteers arrive." His tone carried a kind of practical optimism that surprised Luke. The man had changed since the ravine, less rigid, more willing to meet people where they stood. Saving Riley had reshaped something in him, too. Together, the three walked down the slope behind Luke's cabin, where a clearing opened into a broad, sunlit field framed by young pines. A gentle breeze swept through the grass, making it shimmer like a rolling sea. This was the land they would build upon, the land that would become Haven Run, a sanctuary for retired K9S, abandoned working dogs, and veterans whose four-legged partners had been taken by time or circumstance. The idea had grown naturally from conversations shared over late-night coffee after Luke's rescue of Riley had sparked memories and reflections in all of them. Riley bolted ahead, his tail wagging in wide, excited arcs. He darted between tufts of grass, leaping over fallen branches with a clumsy grace, stopping only to check that Luke was still behind him. When Luke crouched, Riley ran straight into his lap, nudging him with a warm nose. Luke ruffled the young dog's fur gently. "Easy, buddy. We've got work to do." Riley barked once, bright and eager, as if volunteering himself for the task. As they measured the boundaries of the property, they were joined by a man Luke hadn't met before. Tom Wheeler, a retired carpenter from a nearby town. Tom was in his mid-60s, tall, but slightly stooped from decades of heavy labor. His hands were broad and scarred, fingers knotted from arthritis. His hair, once dark, had thinned into wisps of silver that poked from beneath a frayed cap. Though quiet, Tom's eyes were gentle with the unspoken wisdom of someone who had weathered storms harsher than winter. He introduced himself softly, explaining he had read about the new sanctuary in a community bulletin and wanted to help. Luke studied him briefly and sensed in Tom a quiet endurance, a man who had lost things he rarely spoke of, but who still believed in building something better. The four of them spent hours working through the afternoon, driving stakes into soft soil, marking where kennels would stand, sketching out where shaded zones and training areas would be. Emma explained the medical wing she envisioned, a modest but functional space where retired K9S could receive rehabilitation. Dalton outlined safety regulations, his voice steady, but his demeanor far gentler than their first encounter. Tom, with surprising strength, carried beams and offered small adjustments that made the structure more stable. With every passing hour, Haven Run seemed to grow not just from blueprints and lumber, but from something deeper, a shared sense of purpose that stretched across generations. Luke found himself listening to Dalton describe a rescue he had performed as a rookie, or Emma recalling the first animal she had ever treated as a young vet. Even Tom shared a story, his voice low, about a shepherd he had raised with his late wife, a dog who had stayed by her bedside until the very end. Riley stayed close to Luke, wandering occasionally to sniff at boots or tools, but always returning with instinctive certainty that Luke was his anchor. When the sun dipped lower, casting long gold beams across the field, Luke stepped back to take in the progress. Stakes dotted the land like early promises. A rough sketch of the sanctuary stood on a clipboard, and Riley, now chasing his own tail in dizzying circles, filled the open space with life. For the first time in years, Luke felt the absence of war inside him. Not the numbness that used to spread over his chest, but a true absence, replaced by something fuller and quieter. Dalton approached him, folding his arms over his chest as he watched Riley's exuberant sprint through a patch of flowers. "Never seen a pup so attached," he said. "Kid follows you like you hung the moon." Luke smiled. "Maybe he's the one leading me." Emma joined them, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Riley's going to be the heart of this place," she said. "Haven Run will start with him." And Luke knew, in a way he couldn't explain, that she was right. As evening settled, the group shared a simple meal on the grass: bread, apples, warm broth Emma had brought. Tom left early, promising to return with more lumber. Dalton secured the perimeter markers before heading off, leaving the land quiet again. Emma lingered a moment longer, looking across the field with soft eyes. "You built a bridge out of a broken night," she said gently. "Now look at it." Luke glanced toward Riley, who had run to the far edge of the clearing and now turned, sprinting back toward him with unrestrained joy. When the pup leapt into his arms, Luke held him close, breathing in the warm scent of fur and sunlight. For the first time since leaving the service, the ache in his chest eased completely. As daylight faded to amber, Luke stood in the center of Haven Run with Riley at his feet, the wind carrying scents of pine and early spring. The world felt wide and safe. He looked around at the growing sanctuary, the home he didn't know he'd been waiting his whole life to build, and felt something settle inside him, something that had been restless for years. He was no longer lost. He was home. In the end, Luke learned something many of us quietly forget. Healing rarely arrives in grand moments. It often comes softly through a frightened puppy who learns to trust again, through neighbors who show up when it matters, through small acts of courage that rebuild a life piece by piece. Riley's journey reminds us that even the ones who feel most abandoned can become the heartbeat of a new beginning, and that no soul is too broken to be worth saving. Haven Run wasn't just a sanctuary for dogs. It became a sanctuary for people searching for purpose, connection, and a place to call home. And maybe that is our own reminder for everyday life. That kindness still changes the world, that we can lift someone up with a single choice. That love, whether in the shape of a person or a puppy, can guide us back when we have forgotten the way. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about which part moved you the most. And if you believe every second chance matters, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because your support helps us bring more stories of courage, loyalty, and redemption to life. Thank you for watching, and may you always find warmth on your own path home.